So wonderful to see people joining from all around, and people are still joining us. But let us start our conference tonight, or if it is perhaps morning or afternoon, where you are joining us from. Welcome to colleagues, to friends from around the world, to today's important and I would say groundbreaking conference. My name is Tali Nates. I am the founder and director of the Johannesburg Holocaust Genocide Centre. And this conference could not have happened without the partnership of so many. And I would like to mention those partners very, very quickly. Great thank you to the embassies of Ukraine, Poland, and of Israel, to the Ukrainian Volyn National University in Lutsk, Ukraine, to the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Israel, to the University of Warsaw in Poland, and to the Middlesex University in London in the UK. Special thanks to Professor Antonia Bifulco, who initiated this conference and worked tirelessly with our team at the Johannesburg Holocaust Genocide Centre on each and every detail. Tony, we really appreciate you and all you did. In this virtual conference, you will listen and learn from international psychologists and social policy experts who will discuss the traumatic impact of the war in Ukraine on civilians and, of course, on refugees. And we will see all that through newly collected data. The focus of the conference will be on the past impact of war in Ukraine, in Poland, Moldova, and the UK, together with clinical and community initiatives for healing and resilience. And we will hear voices from different parts of those countries, and of course, from Israel as well. It is important for us at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre to continue to keep the topic of Ukraine and the war against Ukraine as one of our focus areas. And as such, it is an absolute honor to invite the ambassador of Ukraine, Ambassador Lyubov Abravitova, to address us first. It is an honor to work with the ambassador on many events in the last month, since the 24th of February, and even before. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Good evening, good morning, good day to all of you who are joining us today. First of all, my words of gratitude and appreciation to the Johannesburg Center of Holocaust and Genocide. It's really a big pleasure to work with you. Your support and your input into bringing the truth to the world is very difficult to overestimate. I also want to acknowledge His Excellency Ambassador of Poland to South Africa and his strong support for all of us here in South Africa, and his country's support to all Ukrainians. It is an important topic that you decided to speak long time ago. It's not the fresh topic that appeared in our minds just recently. I think we were preparing for this conference for a couple of months already, and it was very obvious that the psychological impact of Russian brutal war in Ukraine will go beyond the expectations of the world. Obviously, being a diplomat, I find myself in the difficult situation to speak about the very psychological things on this, but being the not only ambassador, but the citizen of Ukraine and Ukrainian, I would share with you just a couple of words before you go into the more scientific discussion on that. As we're speaking today, we find ourselves in the 202nd day of Russian war in Ukraine. And thousands of kilometers away from the conflict, you have been watching the unprovoked, brutal, unfair war in my country in real time through a screen of your TV or through your phone on social media apps. The images of destructions, people in shelters, Ukrainian civilians suffering, and many other tragic events are a lot to process. And what differs this war from other wars and conflicts in the world is that events in Ukraine are being broadcast live, not only through traditional news outlets, but through apps in Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and at the rate that the world never seen before. The violent images of Russian invasion are spreading worldwide. And when you look at the rates, some of those are getting rates over 600 million times of watching in a few days. And these images and audio clips can be triggering for everyone and have an immense psychological impact to many, many people. As of today, when you just think about the numbers, the damage or destruction in Ukraine to only civilian infrastructure facilities is over 41,000. And it includes over 32,000 residential buildings and houses. But when we're speaking about the facilities, we are forgetting that the toll of lives, of damaged souls is even unknown as of today. We have only statistics that is available officially, which says that the killing of more than 7,000 people starting from the 24th of February happened. And that includes 383 children. How many wounded people? It's more than 10,000, including 700 plus children. The figure is growing daily. And do not take into account the occupied territories to which law enforcement officers do not have any access. This is something that the world will need to live further. Ukrainians will need to live further. And we don't have to forget that psychological trauma will be even more damageable and painful. Maybe you will come back to this during the further discussions. Not only those who are affected today by Russian invasion and Russian war, but also for those who today are finding themselves under huge propaganda, who is not really aware about what is happening, and they will find out this truth further. When I was preparing to talk through the introductory message to you, I was thinking that probably all of us are psychologically traumatized today to a certain extent. And it is important to have these discussions, not only to know how to handle it, but also to prevent in the future. Because so many times we're saying never again. And now when it's again, we need to speak about all the aspects of the war, including this. That's why I'm grateful to all the participants to join their brains and hands together to speak about that. I'm sure it will be a great discussion, and thank you again.
Ambassador Abravitova, it is an honor to have you with us and to open the proceedings with reflections on the situation back home, which we will reflect through in today's conference. Now, it is my pleasure to invite the Ambassador of the Republic of Poland, His Excellency Andrzej Kantak, to share with us his opening address. Thank you very much, Ambassador Kantak, for your long-time partnership. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tali. I'm really honored to have this opportunity to make this short introductory address at this groundbreaking conference. And let me first to express my appreciation and thanks to all who have contributed to the organization of today's webinar. In particular to Professor Antonia Bifulco for her valuable initiative, and to Tali Nates and her team from Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre for organization and support, as well as to today's guest speakers, the senior academics representing universities from 4 countries: Middlesex University in the UK, Volyn University, Ukraine, Warsaw University, Poland, and Hebrew University in Israel. Thanks to your efforts and contribution, this important virtual conference on the psychological toll of the current war in Ukraine and its traumatic impact has materialized. War spares no one. It destroys entire societies. Wars lead to the degradation of society, and by dealing with brutality, death, and helplessness against it, they bring about changes in the psyche of people who have survived the atrocities of war. Armed conflicts lead to persecution, murder, injustice, and have a huge impact on the psyche both of soldiers and of civilians who involuntarily participate in an armed conflict. Waging the war against Ukraine, Russia has steadily escalated its use of modern military weapons against Ukrainian civil targets. I underline civil targets, in a ways that have a massive impact on its economy and the population. The Russian response to urban warfare has become a siege fought with modern missiles and artillery that have been fired against a steadily broadening range of civil targets, destroying much of the economy, infrastructure, civil facilities, and housing in eastern Ukraine. Millions of people living in Ukraine had to flee their homes after Russia invaded the country in February this year. According to the United Nations official figures, over 12.3 million have left Ukraine so far. They left behind everything they've ever had and known. Today, in our modern times, we see in our own country, Poland, the ordeal and trauma of thousands of refugees. The fate of the innocent people has become more dramatic than ever after the Second World War. As of September 12th, of yesterday, 6,239,105 refugees have crossed Polish-Ukrainian border since the beginning of the invasion. 93% of them were women and children. Polish people have opened their hearts and homes to more than 3 million Ukrainians. I must admit, we are proud of this response. During the war, Ukrainian young people have suffered from exposure to abuse and violence and the loss of their closest friends and family members. Tragic events have been remembered, and the inability to get rid of them additionally hurts the victims' psyche. Daily pictures and videos of atrocities suffered in Ukraine appear continuously across the media. Fear, anxiety, and depression are prevailing emotions, together with the grief and even survivors' guilt. The atrocities seem unimaginable, and those pictures alone are traumatic enough. Living in constant fear while struggling to find safety and security has taken a toll on Ukrainians' mental health. Their response of identity has been stripped without any ability to prepare for it. The entire world was turned upside down overnight. People felt lost. Those situations cause an increased level of psychological problems, such as post-traumatic stress disorders, depression, and anxiety disorders. Attention is given to their immediate needs for food, clothing, and housing. However, the lack of ability to focus on mental health is yielding a heavy toll. As Ukrainians deal with being ripped away from their homes and families, as well as the trauma of death and injury, their mental health needs to be a priority for them, now and in the future. That's why I believe that our today's conference, presenting research on the negative psychological consequences of war, is an important contribution to supporting Ukraine at this difficult time of war. I'm very grateful to all the contributors and participants of this conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kantak, for your important remarks and at times staggering figures that you shared with us. We will reflect much more on that data and more in our conference today. As I shared in the start of the program, Ambassador of Israel, His Excellency Eli Bello-Cherkovsky, could not join us in person as he is in Rwanda, but he sent his reflections to me, and I will share those now with you. The war has shocked the whole of the European continent that for decades believed in, open quotas, peace in our times, close quotas. The Russian invasion is causing a tremendous humanitarian crisis. The rich and hospitable country has been turned into a site of massive devastation with millions of refugees. There is and cannot be any justification for the Russian action. The West is moving away from Russia, and the level of engagement is being reduced while the level of containment increases. This is a dangerous trend, as Russia, when isolated, can be even more unpredictable. Turning Russia into a pariah state will push it into the arms of extremists like Iran or North Korea. The war has caused a historical rift between the two brotherly people, Ukrainians and Russians. And as of now, it seems that it will take countless years to heal the wounds. And Ambassador is wishing a fruitful conference to all of us. So with these final words of our partners from the Embassy of Israel, I will now like to just go through a few housekeeping rules. One, please remember to mute yourself. We please ask that everyone that is not speaking will mute yourself. And then please remember to use the chat for all your comments, for all your questions. And the way we will do it is that after every presentation, we will give 5 to 10 minutes for a discussion, and I will be able to monitor the chat. So just put all your comments in the chat as we go along. I will now like to introduce you to Professor Antonia Bifulco, who will take the proceedings forward. Every wonderful presenter that will share with us their findings and their research will be introduced in a short manner, and I will do that now with Antonia. But please look at the chat, because the full or a short bio will be placed in the chat, and you can see more about each one of the presenters. Professor Antonia Bifulco, who will manage the proceedings, is a professor of lifespan psychology and director of the Centre for Abuse and Trauma Studies at Middlesex University, London. And she is interested specifically nowadays in the impacts of war across generations. Professor Bifulco, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tali. Thank you also for all your wonderful organization with your team in organizing this event, and particular thanks to the ambassadors for their very moving introductions to this conference. So what I will present is called Introducing War Trauma and its Psychological Impacts, with Echoes of Past Atrocities in East Europe. And also I'll outline here the conference themes to give you an idea of what you will be hearing this evening. Firstly, trauma in the past. So I will talk about definitions of trauma and how it affects people, so that people, you attending, can understand how we see it as psychologists, and it will help you follow the other presentations, which won't be very technical, but will be based on real research. But also, I would like to bring up the topic of what we can learn from past war trauma. So past events in East Europe, and what that has led to in clinical terms. Trauma in the present will be the next theme, and here we'll hear from about the experience of Ukrainian civilians and combatants in current war from our Ukrainian contributor, who has very up-to-date data on that. And then the experience of refugees in Poland, Moldova, and UK from experts in different countries who have been working with them. And then trauma in the future, we will have a contributor talking about interventions and treatments for war impacts, and the sort of community resilience we'll need to build when hopefully all this is finished. I think I've no need to explain what has happened, but basically since February, Russia invades Ukraine, and without warning, with explosions and attacks on the major cities. of course, we know that East Ukraine has actually been under conflict since 2014, but in February it spread over the whole country. This led to sanctions to Russia from Western allies and large alliance for Ukraine against Russia entailed. And the fallout, as has been mentioned by the ambassadors, is millions of Ukrainian refugees, mostly women, children and elderly, escaping to Poland and other nearby countries. It's affected food exports to Africa. Of course, Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of Europe. It produces a lot of food. Fuel exports from Russia to Europe have been restricted, and fighting at places like Chernobyl and Zaporizhia, which are nuclear reactors, has caused concern of nuclear catastrophe. So you can see we have trauma on a large scale, but as was already mentioned, Russia in denial that it's war. So the first thing I'd like to just clarify is what is trauma, and this is obviously from a psychologist's point of view. And I should also point out that it's only been included as part of a clinical diagnosis since 1980. And the treatments for trauma have really only been established since the 1990s. Been really well known. So it's pretty recent. And when we think about past trauma, it's one of the reasons that people in the past were not well served by psychologists and other services. So trauma involves two different aspects. One is the exposure or the trauma event, the thing that happened, and the other is the impact, the person being traumatized. And it's important to understand that both of these are involved, and sometimes the language is ambiguous. So trauma events are where the individual experiences or is confronted with actual threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And this is known as primary trauma. But it's also an occurrence where an individual sees or witnesses a risk to the life or physical safety of another person. And this is called secondary trauma. In terms of the impact on the person, the individual expects to feel terror, fear, helplessness, etc., and basically a loss of feeling of security. The world is no longer a safe place. But in terms of clinical disorder, the disorder named for this is post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, but also depression, anxiety, substance abuse. There are other disorders that can also arise. And as well as a clinical disorder are lasting vulnerabilities. For instance, attachment difficulties, so difficulties with close relationships, fear of others, and mistrust. And just expanding a little bit more on primary versus secondary trauma, if you look at these circles in the center, dark blue, is the person who is the focus of the trauma. And so that is usually what we think about, the person who is involved where a bomb went off or where somebody was killed or was hurt themselves. Then we have those who were directly observed it, who are close to the site, and this may be other victims, but it also may be first responders, so medical people, firefighters, etc. And both of those usually count as primary trauma. But then we have sort of areas of witnessing. One is sort of from professionals, and this would be psychologists, counselors, maybe social workers, who listen to the accounts of people who experience trauma and who may also hear them reliving the trauma. And over time, this can affect the workers involved who are exposed to this sort of secondary trauma. And of course, if we think about psychologists and other professionals working in Ukraine, they may be experiencing primary trauma since they're in the war themselves, but also the secondary trauma of hearing other people's accounts. But then I would suggest it goes wider than that to witnesses from the family. So the person who has experienced trauma will show signs of reliving it and fear and anger, etc. And this can be very frightening for the family. So children brought up in this household or partners who will also be experiencing secondhand the trauma that occurred. So you can see that an initial trauma has a wide effect in terms of people involved. So what do we mean by trauma experiences? This is a checklist that's used quite often in trauma research, and it just lists the sort of things that are covered by trauma exposure. And on the left-hand side, you'll see things that happen in ordinary life in a way, natural disasters, fires, transportation accidents, accidents at work, exposure to toxic substance, physical assaults, assaults with weapons, sexual assaults. Those can happen in any context, really. But what I've done is mark with a star the ones that can also happen more often in wartime. And on the right, you've got those that are more common in war. So combat or exposure to a war zone. And this would be for military or civilian, or victims or perpetrators. So everybody is affected by the exposure. Captivity, being kidnapped or deported or held prisoner of war, life-threatening illness or injury, severe human suffering, sudden violent death, sudden accidental death, and serious injury, harm, or death you cause to someone else. So you can see trauma occurs on both sides of the coin. And you can see from the number of stars that are marked here that trauma can be multiple. You can experience a number of these. It can be repeated, so the same thing, like being in a bombing, can happen repeatedly, and it can be chronic. So we know this war since February has gone on for sort of 7 months or so. The sort of exposure over time just increases the damage that can be done to people psychologically. And if we think about war trauma for civilians, of course, there's a particular instance of rape in women and girls in Ukraine. And this quote is taken from an article in the New Yorker this year by Joshua Yaffa. And he says, in early April, hundreds of women and children who reportedly had been subject to rape were evacuated from the liberated territories. Dozens of rape cases have so far been investigated for possible criminal prosecution. Many attackers had their faces covered, created an aura of anonymity, removing any sense of fear or norms and pushing each person towards maximum barbarity. But even more troubling was the sense that Russian soldiers were driven by a desire to punish, to cause harm and destroy the population's will. And I think this idea about it being a punishment, which actually has come up in earlier interviews from decades before about with Russian soldiers, but also possible criminal prosecution, because I think maybe this is the first time that getting criminal prosecutions together at this stage early in the war has happened. Other stressful events for Ukrainian refugees abroad, in a way these don't constitute trauma, but added stresses to the prior trauma. Loss, losing a country and home, separation from family, that's in addition to any bereavements, losing a job, studies, status, and then danger, moving to a new country, where to live, language issues, how to communicate, bureaucracy, re-immigration, resolution of status, maybe at some stage resentment or compassion fatigue from host nationals, dealing with war health consequences, and of course an uncertain future. So those are the trauma experiences. But if we come to the impacts, here's a quote from Van der Kolk, who's a specialist in this area. Traumatized people simultaneously remember too little and too much. Telling the story is important. Without stories, memory becomes frozen. And also from the Yaffa article I described earlier, when there is so much tragedy all around, people begin to feel shame that they don't have it as bad as others, or they are to blame. So I hope this doesn't seem too technical, but this is the actual clinical diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder that's in clinical manuals. And it'll just give you an idea of the range of symptoms or behaviors that people might experience. The first thing, there needs to be an actual trauma event identified. Sometimes that can be in the past. So there are cases where the symptoms are delayed and the trauma event is in the past. And then, if you remember the quote about remembering too much and remembering too little, the reliving is one aspect. It's where the individual has reoccurring, upsetting memories that are intrusive in terms of flashbacks or nightmares. So that's the over-remembering. And then the avoidance is where the person tries to avoid thoughts, feelings, or physical sensation that bring up these memories, and even people, places, conversations. So this is an attempt to shut down the memories. So it's remembering too much and then too little. But as well as that, negative thoughts or feelings, like remembering an important aspect, feeling bad about yourself, others, the world, more self-blame or blame of others, and shame, anger, and fear, and being detached from others. And then arousal and reactivity, irritability or aggressive behavior, self-destructive behavior, feeling constantly on guard that danger is present, problem sleeping, and then the duration, it must last at least 1 month. This requirement is because most people will feel these things after a trauma event, but it's the people who don't then normalize after a few weeks, who carry on with these symptoms that move into PTSD. And it causes impairment. In other words, it interferes with their daily lives. And if we look at how common this is in the usual population, this is based on a paper on trauma and PTSD in a number of countries by Kessler. And he showed that the risk of PTSD is 4% after trauma exposure. So can you see this is a low rate in the general population, 4%, and that's after a trauma exposure, an event. It does vary by type of trauma, and interpersonal violence has highest risk of PTSD. And yet most people, 70% in this sample, experience lifetime traumas, and an average of 3 per person. So most people have trauma, only a very small proportion have PTSD. But the average duration is 6 years, and then 13 years for trauma involving war. So it's a very long-lasting disorder. But 25 to 40%, this was across the different countries, recover within 1 year, many within 6 months. And there's a much lower rapid rate of recovery amongst people with war-related PTSD. So you see, it's generally not very prevalent, but very long-lasting. And there's a paper looking at trajectories of PTSD over years, and this was a study in Israel of combatants, and over 42 years. And what they showed is a large proportion were resilient. In other words, they had combat trauma, but they didn't get PTSD. That's the 43%. 27% did have PTSD, but recovered. But notice there are 21% who had it chronically. And this study was over 42 years. So we talk about many, many years. And 7%, it was delayed. So they didn't get PTSD at the time of the war trauma, but maybe some years later. And we have heard about that with veterans in particular. So what can we learn from the past, from previous European conflicts, and about lifelong and intergenerational impacts? Well, there's very interesting studies by Professor Liz Krolikowska and her colleagues at the University of Warsaw about long-term effects of war trauma in Polish civilians. And this was a study of 120 such survivors, and they were aged 71 to 97, so really elderly. And this was, of course, 70 years after the events in question. And she found 32% had PTSD. And this was related to the number of war trauma events. It was an average of 7. So in other words, the more trauma events, the more likely the PTSD. And within that, she showed 50% rates in survivors of deportations to Siberian labor camps by the Russians in February 1940. So that subgroup had even higher rates. And I know there are people who have tuned in today who are descendants of the Serdtse, either in South Africa or in UK. And this is comparable to the 55% found among Jewish Holocaust survivors. So these rates, compared to the 4% you would normally get, are terrifically high. And in the paper, this team explore reasons for why it's so high in Poland. First thing is the disturbance of social memory mechanisms. Under communism, Poles were forbidden to speak of wartime atrocities, particularly those perpetrated by Russians. There was avoidance of addressing all World War II trauma, so there were dominant narratives, but it didn't cover all victim groups. And there was a lack of social education. There was little understanding of psychotrauma, and services were generally unavailable. And in terms of social acknowledgement being a major factor in whether people can accept what happened to them and move on, if we look at some historical events and when they were recognized politically, we can see the long periods involved. So some of you will know, of course, about the Holodomor in Ukraine in 1932-3, which was forced starvation of Ukrainians, and 4 million died. And the recognition of genocide, at least in the West, was in 2006, and that's 70 years later. And the Katyn massacre of 25,000 Polish officers by Russians in 1940 was acknowledged finally by Mikhail Gorbachev in 1990, 50 years later, but there was no war crime tribunal. And the Siberian deportation by Russians of 1.5 million Poles, of whom 1 million perished, that was in 1941, no official Russian acknowledgement after 70 years, and again, no war crime tribunal. And now the Ukrainian war, obviously started 2014, but now 2022, again, no official Russian acknowledgement, but this time Western acknowledgement and war crime prosecution seem to be in preparation. So what about intergenerational trauma? And most of what we know comes from the Holocaust studies undertaken in Israel and elsewhere. And what we know, to summarize, is the first generation have primary trauma and PTSD, as we might expect. Of course, not all, but a proportion. And this leads to a terrifying worldview and being in sort of survival mode. And it leads to overprotective and ambivalent parenting. And so we get in the second generation secondary trauma impacts and something called role reversal, which is the pressure to care for parents from an early age, but also parenting difficulties themselves, being overprotective, but not encouraging children's autonomy. And then third generation, again, secondary trauma impacts some lifetime emotional problems, but also something that's called in the literature event centrality, which I think is interesting. It's when the identity of the individual or the families are built around that political event or trauma. So families for whom the Holocaust or the Siberian deportations or the Holodomor become a theme that is carried on through generations. And so we have the idea of continuous trauma, that layers of earlier trauma reduce longer-term resilience and increase risk of longer-term and more complex disorder patterns. So if we think of Ukraine, there are families who have lasting trauma from the Holodomor, World War II, and things like Chernobyl, as well as the current war. And so professional help is likely to be needed on a large scale. But many are resilient and they can manage their emotions, they can gain support, feel gratitude for surviving and help received, remain optimistic, have meaning in their lives, say through religion or altruism or family, and can forgive or accept, but maybe not forget. Sorry. And this is a quote I quite liked from Frederick's writing about Katyn. In instances of mass murder or crimes against humanity, who does the forgiving and what or whom does one forgive? Is it the nation that needs to forgive, or is it the individuals affected by the crime? And does one forgive the perpetrators, the act, or the ideology that made the crime possible? So to conclude, psychologists and others are needed to help traumatize Ukrainians on a large scale and to build community resilience for a better future. We hope this conference will raise awareness. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Bifulco, for introducing us into this complex matter of PTSD trauma and making the connections to past genocides, the Holocaust, other mass atrocities, and now Ukraine. Now, if you do not mind to take few maybe comments or questions, we'll just take few moments if people want to either write a comment or question in the chat. I remind you the chat is open and you can do so, or if anyone would like to raise their hand and you know, then I can allow them to unmute themselves and discuss it. We will have more time for a proper discussion in the end of the conference, but I will allow just for a few minutes if anyone would like to ask a question or give a comment about this section about trauma and PTSD. Antonia, I think it was absolutely clear, and but people need to sit, I think, with this material. So maybe let's take it forward, and then people will continue to use the chat to give some more comments.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So thank you, Tali. And I'd like now to introduce Professor Larysa Zasiekina, who is from Ukraine. She's from the Lasya Ukrainka Volyn National University. She is the founder and director of the Ukrainian Psychotrauma Centre, so therefore as a clinical psychologist and expert in trauma. And she is presenting some new data from Ukraine, which will show issues about trauma as it's being experienced by both civilians and combatants in Ukraine sort of right now. So thank you, Larysa.
Thank you, Antonia, for introducing me, and thank you for your great initiative aligned with this conference. It's very important. So, of course, war is very painful experience, and any war results in irreplaceable losses and grief aligned with trauma. And if to talk, and if to talk about trauma, it's clear that it could occur in different levels, and we could talk about individual trauma, and then it's of course connected with the person, and some traumas connected with family histories, and then we talk about family traumas. And of course, some traumas like war or genocide are connected with culture, and then we are talking about historical, cultural, or collective traumas. And if to talk about the war trauma, sorry, I don't know how to.
On your computer, maybe do the down arrow. Just on your computer, the down arrow.
Yeah, I did, but it doesn't help.
Do you want to close the PowerPoint and start again?
Yeah.
Oh, here it's happening.
But it doesn't allow me then. Okay, probably here. Yeah. And of course, if we are talking about war trauma, it is connected with all these levels. Each war trauma is individual trauma, each war trauma is family trauma, and each war trauma is community trauma. And another point or another issue of war trauma is connected that each trauma, war trauma, is a great intrusion of the past into present. And of course, some traumatic events occurred in the past, but symptoms are always in the present. And Antonia presented us the symptoms, for example, of PTSD, like distortions in emotions and cognitions, or for example, avoidance or hyperarousal. And all these symptoms are today. So we could say that each trauma develops precarious present. And I'd like to talk about trauma of Ukrainians today. And the aim of my presentation is to extend our understanding of emotional distress in civilian population compared to the military service members during war atrocity. And if we are talking about war trauma, of course, especially in civilians, we could keep in our mind some vulnerable groups of population. And if we are talking about these vulnerable groups of population, there is some construct, and this construct is double insult. And as a rule, when we are talking about double insult, we mean women, we mean children, and adolescents. And there are some social and biological evidence for it. And it's very interesting research about the Kosovo conflict. And the results of this research show that all victims are viewed through social norms. And for example, if we take men who were injured in fighting the enemies, the community as a rule express support and pride for these men. But if, for example, women are sexually assaulted, the community as a rule reject and expresses the shame for these women. And it is one social evidence why women are vulnerable population. And gender or women-centered perspective was suggested by Jacobs. And the scholars define some gender-specific traumas. And women-specific traumas are sexual assault, reproductive abuse, killing or abandoning children. And about these traumas, only women could talk and explain and describe these traumas for us. And another idea of Newmark, and I like this idea, that each war or each collective trauma is always misogynistic because it is directed predominantly at women, since they are considered as cultural and biological repository of nation. And there are some evidence. Yes, there is one research, it's recent research, and the results show that women veteran who were separated from military service during last 3 years, and if these women have PTSD, their PTSD is associated with prenatal outcomes, poor outcomes like preterm birth or postpartum depression or anxiety, or some perceived difficult pregnancy. And in this case, we could observe the biological transmission of trauma, and we could consider the women as biological repository of nation. And another group, a very vulnerable group, is adolescents. And we could explain it as well from neurological and social perspective. And if to talk about this biological vulnerability or neurological vulnerability, we could know some laws or some mystery of teenagers' period, yes, and of their brain. And probably you know that in teenage period, there is the peak of development of gray matter of the brain and cortical thickness. And coincidentally, these parts of the brain are the mostly affected when the person has PTSD. What does it mean? It means that when adolescent has experienced some traumatic event, these parts of brain are affected mostly, and it's a great probability that these parts of brain will be undeveloped. In addition, these undeveloped parts of the brain are observed during the lifespan, so it's very difficult to improve it. And if this gray matter is undeveloped, or if this cortical thinning is observed, it is connected with anxiety, arousal, some distortions of memory for cognitive stimuli. So then we could speak about social cognition, and it's also connected with distortions in general intelligence. And of course, if to talk about social evidence why adolescents are vulnerable population, because of course they have limited experience, they have limited knowledge how to cope with all these traumatic events. And if to talk further, there is one construct which is very closely connected with PTSD, and it is also very connected with war trauma. And I'd like to talk about moral injury. And moral injury is some emotional distress or some suffering which is result as of violation of ethical principles or ethical beliefs. And I like the research of Fleming, and he points out that it's not like violation of ethical principles. During the war, it's much deeper. It's like ethical dilemma. And he defines some ethical paradoxes or ethical dilemmas which are observed during the war. And you can see all of them in the slide, but I'd like to comment one of them, like religious belief versus military values, because Ukrainians are very religious nation, and predominantly, mostly Ukrainians are Eastern Orthodox Christians, and as many religions, we have a commandment not to kill, yes, or to love your enemy, or to love your neighbor. And of course, in this case, it's a great opposition to military duty, to professional military duty. And for example, when I'm counseling now civilians, some people tell me that they have a problem because they are fulfilled with hatred for Russian people. And they asked me what to do, because it's violation of their moral principle, because they know that there is commandment, you have to love your enemy. And they told me, but I cannot cope with my hatred. And in this case, I have my own recipe. I recommend just to think not about Russians, but to think about Ukrainian combatants, Ukrainian military service, which are very courageous, which are very brave. And in this case, when I do this shift from Russians to Ukrainians, I am feeling with pride, with courage, with confidence in our victory. And we did some conceptual analysis based on narratives of civilians, and we found out that the potential moral injury situations in Ukraine are connected with injuring others, with rape, with atrocities, with the situation where it is impossible to save the life of others, or when people just lose contacts with their relatives or something like that. And we conducted some research, and 281 participants were recruited in our research. And we had 3 samples: Ukrainian Air Forces, Ukrainian civilian population, which is presented by women and adolescents, because we consider them the most vulnerable population in civilians. And also we recruit some participants from National Guard, Ukrainian National Guard. These people do not they are not in front line, of the war, but they defend some important military objects like nuclear stations, and some of them also defend the border between Ukraine and Belarus. And we used some measures for assessment. You can see them in our slide. And then I like to demonstrate this slide, and you can see that the high indices of PCL, so which express the tendency for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, the high indices for depression and anxiety are observed in civilian population. And only moral injury is higher in military service. And people, if to talk about military service members, we could see that the highest indices are in people in the military services who are in front line of the war, and a bit lower in National Guard. And the most surprising fact that civilians demonstrate so high indices of depression, of anxiety and PTSD. And if to look through research of the studies during the war, you could see that the most research are related to assessment or to examining or presenting results in combatants, not in civilians. And I think that it's high time to shift or to pay attention to civilians, because they are suffering a lot during the war. And I'd like now to talk about the possible reasons why these indices are so high in Ukrainians during this war. And I have some ideas, and I'd like to share with you. And I think that post-pandemic time, because you know that Ukrainians were going just to come to their offline settings in their offices, in their universities at the end of February. And we didn't have time to do it because on the 24th of February, the war started. And we just transformed from one social isolation to another one. And of course, social isolation, and we have a lot of evidences, a lot of results that social isolation brings a lot of emotional distress for people all around the world. Another point that we had, Ukrainians had very low preparedness, psychological preparedness, I mean, for this war, because we grew up in one setting. We grew up in the Soviet Union, and we were we had a lot of common or joint heritage, I mean, in different fields of our life, in different fields of societies, in economics, in the arts, in even in the television, in mass media, in everything. And that's why, of course, people probably expected some special operation by Russians, but of course, people did not expect such huge, such range, such cruelty of this war. Then double forced migration actually was started to 2014, and you know that many people from the east migrated to other oblasts in Ukraine, and mostly people developed from the east oblast to Kyiv, to Kharkiv, to Sumy, to some central parts of Ukraine. And now, when this war started, all these people had to migrate again, and some people just became displaced people, some people became refugees. But I should emphasize that we have double forced migration, and many people. And what does it mean, migration? Migration is always connected with the loss of homes, loss of families or relatives, of jobs, and many other points. So many people experienced double forced migration, and we could say about this double insult again for this group of people. And another point, we have transgenerational transmission of trauma, of genocide, and Antonia told about great genocide, very huge genocide, a cruel genocide of Ukrainian people, because if to look through the literature about different genocides, different kinds of genocide, and you know that genocide is awful thing, nevertheless, what kind of it, but the most awful thing is genocide, or killing people from hunger. Starvation is the most difficult experienced death. So that's why now when we hear some facts or ideas about deficit of grain, about possible hunger in the world because of the Ukrainian situation, of course it's a great trigger for people who experienced genocide, for people who are descendants, offspring of survivors or victims of genocide. And of course, all these things all together could cause these high indices of emotional sufferings and emotional distress in Ukrainian people. And also, I'd like to give an example of Churchill idea. He told it on BBC broadcast, and he refers to Russia as Russia's reaction to Hitler's ambitions towards Eastern Europe, and it was in 1939, and literally Churchill told, "I cannot forecast to you the action of Russia. It is a riddle wrapped inside the mystery, inside in enigma." And I'd like we could say literally the same in this situation. No could predict the reaction of Russia. No could predict the conduct of Russia. No could predict anything connected with Russia. And considering this fact that Ukraine has this neighbor, I mean, two neighbors even, Russia and Belarus, but recently I was corrected that I should talk not about neighbors, but about the governmental policy of these neighbors. Probably it would be more delicate and ethical. So considering the fact of these governmental policies of our neighbors, we have no choice as only one way to develop our national security system. And there are a lot of ways how to do it. Of course, it depends on economics, it depends on weapons and modern weapons and so on. But as clinical psychologist, I see the way or important part of developing of national social security system is developing resilience. And when my first slide was about war trauma, that it is always connected with three levels: individual, family, and community. And that's why I consider that it's very important to develop our resilience at these three levels: in individual level, at family level, and at community level. And only in this case we could develop our independence, we could close our victory, and of course Ukraine will win, no doubt. And I'd like to thank all my team, because we are conducting research with emotional distress in civilians, in combatants during this wartime. And I'd like to thank all of you for supporting Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Larysa. That was really a fascinating presentation. and the whole issue of double insult is particularly enlightening, I think. And of course, the pandemic, which you mentioned, which seems to have got lost in our consciousness now with all this. So, Talia, I don't know if there's been any comments in the chat that we could bring up.
Sure. First of all, a quick question to you, and maybe it is beneficial to actually clarify that, and that is Geraldine Thomas, who is, of course, thanking you and is asking about any research on the way trauma is also transmitted by way of shared environment, by children who may import psychic trauma to others, trauma to others in a classroom, or from those who join a community. So maybe just to unpack that in connection also to Larysa's individual family community pyramid.
Thank you, and hi, Geraldine. It's a good question. I think we just don't know enough about secondary trauma and the idea of witnessing it and how that can cascade to others, because obviously the original person may be in the trauma situation, then transmits that to somebody else who may have responsibility for them or be close to them, and then that might come to a whole group level. And I think we just don't have that research. But I think the implications of what you're saying is if these refugee children are either collecting together or with other children, then there can be a kind of cascade of some of the fear that they might bring with them. And I'm sure you yourself may have some ideas on this, since you work with children with mental health difficulties. But for me, the whole notion of secondary trauma and this almost contagion, I think the Ukrainian ambassador talked about populations being traumatized by watching this on TV all day. And it's really quite frightening to see a war unfold as you're watching it on the screen. And I visited Greece briefly, and they had it on 24 hours a day. I'm thinking, well, if everybody in Europe is watching this and elsewhere, then how is it affecting us all? And obviously children are so much more susceptible. So I don't know the answer, but I think you're raising an important issue. So for those who'll be working with refugees, to think about some amplification maybe of the trauma in the relating amongst young people who together are sharing stories. I think it's an important point. Thank you.
I'm not sure if Larysa has anything to add, and if not, Larysa, anything to add to this point?
No, I think that Antonia covered it. Thank you.
Wonderful. So we will continue, and maybe just one more question to Larysa and to you, Antonia. Has there been, from Susan Harris, has there been any research on how the war is affecting Holocaust survivors still living in Ukraine? And maybe Larysa, you know anything, any research being done?
Yes, unfortunately, we didn't do any research. I mean, we didn't do any assessment during this war and connecting Holocaust or Holodomor survivors, because but when we collected our data, I mean, in civilians and in combatants, one of the question in demographics, we had question if there was some family trauma in family history, like the Holocaust or the Holodomor, and we had some preliminary data. But we didn't interpret it at the deep level, but our pilot, yes, like preliminary data showed that the most vulnerable population are people who descendants of the victims of the Holodomor, but not of the Holocaust. But actually, when I found this preliminary data, I didn't know how to explain it. And that's why we just think of it. But just the complex study about the descendants of the victims of the Holodomor and the Holocaust. We didn't meet, and I didn't meet any research because probably it's not so much time. Yes, it's yes, past, but the preliminary data surprised us. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think we're only just getting to the point of realizing not only do we have to study what's happening in front of us, which is difficult during a war, but realizing there's the past. So it's a bit like Geraldine's question about the cascade, it's the past as well. And if you've got a group who have managed to defend themselves against the fears of their parents or grandparents about the world being so dangerous, and then suddenly the world is dangerous again, it's you know, it's must be like falling off a cliff edge, you know, that it's like happening again. And I can see why that would set up particular sensitivities. But, you know, there's so little research done, even on the intergenerational relatively, but also how we can do this now during war. It's going to be a challenge, but it's a great question.
Just lots of thank yous, and maybe we'll just take these two, and then the rest we will go after that. But Maureen is saying, I think it is interesting to look back on behaviors we may consider to be family traits in relation embedded effects of PTSD. And then Carol Wengro is saying, have children been able to go to school at all? Impact on children of missing school, enormous anxiety and trauma, I imagine. And again, Larysa, I don't know if you want to start, and then Antonia, you can add.
Yes, I'd like to say that it was a great discussion in our Ministry of Education and Science in Ukraine, if to start our education offline or online, because, you know, it's not very good to study offline, considering the national security and the security of these children. But the ministry decided just let people go to school in order just to adjust, not to avoid this situation, probably like some way, one of the ways to cope with trauma, in order to communicate with each other. Because, you know, place is not any place or space, it's not only the physical location of this place, it's like some sense of place. And sense of place, it's like a emotional contacts, some sense of this place. And probably schools could be this place for emotional contacts for children, for adolescents, which are so necessary in this period. So, but it was a great dilemma for our ministry how to do, and a lot of scholars and psychologists attracted in order to find a good way for it.
Antonia, anything to add? And I suggest that if not, we will move on and collect more questions for the next round.
Okay, I think let's do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Larysa. Thank you.
Yeah. So our next speaker, and this next section is all going to be about refugees. So we have 3 shorter sessions on refugees in different countries. And our first one is about refugees in Poland, and it's from Professor Jadwiga Krolikowska at the University of Warsaw. And she's Director of Specialization, Migrations and Cultural Integration, working at the Integrated Legal and Social Studies group in Warsaw University. And she's going to talk about the experience of the refugees in Poland. Now, I shall share my screen because I'm going to get the presentation for her. And let's see if I can get that going. So, Jadwiga, if you would like to take stage.
Yes, hello. I'd like to thank you for the organizers just to invite me for this very interesting conference, and very important because of all these events around us in Poland. My perspective as a sociologist and as a citizen of Poland is slightly different from this psychologist's perspective. And I would like to explain that I collected data as a sociologist. In recent history, Polish society has had no experience of sudden and unexpected military migration on such a large scale. Poles were surprised and terrified by the war situation. Tragic memories of World War II were revived. It was in February the 24th. The experience of recent years since 2004 has been the influx of economic migrants to Poland as an EU country from across the eastern border, mainly from Ukraine. Since 2004, there have been from 1.3 million to 1.5 million Ukrainian labor migrants in Poland. On Friday, September the 9th, 2022, the Border Guard announced that since February 24th, the Polish-Ukrainian border had been crossed by over 6.1 million refugees from Ukraine. They were mainly women and children. Every day, usually 23,000 of refugees have been coming to Poland. And the most important is how demography changed in Poland. The population of Warsaw has grown by 15%. The population of Krakow grows 23%, and in Gdańsk by even 34%. So demography and the social problems changed. The people who have crossed the border after February the 24th are entitled to a personal ID number. It is called in Polish PESEL, which in turn entitles them to take up legal work, free healthcare, education, social assistance, financial support when starting a business, child benefits called 500 plus, a Good Start project for children, and other benefits from social insurance, such as disability pensions. The Polish authorities' decision of February the 24th, 2022, to open the border to refugees made possible a smooth crossing of border points, not only on the basis of passports, but sometimes on the presentation of documents such as birth certificate. War refugees arrived at the border using local means of transport, and their journey through Ukraine sometimes took 12 to 17 hours. They reached the border physically and mentally exhausted, without the necessary things, medicines, food, or clothes. They were lost in the prevailing chaos. Women with children, especially the smallest one, were in a particularly difficult situation. It was extremely important after crossing the border, they would receive warm food, clothing, medical assistance, information in their mother tongue, free transport from private persons and from the state. Polish Railways launched 1,000 trains on which Ukrainians traveled cost-free deep into the country. From February the 24th to May this year, rail and bus transport, as well as admission to cinemas, museums, and so on, were cost-free for Ukrainians. They took advantage of this to stabilize their situation, because it was not typical. It was some kind of summertime. They were abroad. They were out of their home, and it helped them just to be in this new country as their second home. The health service provided assistance free of charge in state institutions on the basis of a simple procedure of presenting a document or a copy of it, confirming the crossing of the border. Great responsibility for organizing the reception of refugees rested with the authorities of border towns, for instance, Przemyśl. Rest areas, information points, medical and psychological assistance were provided in these towns. Children were given toys, the elderly were helped with transport, and people with PTSD were provided with diagnosis. It was the first diagnosis for these people. Some of them, they didn't know, they were not conscious that they are in this situation. Border towns accepted not only refugees, but also volunteers and non-governmental organizations that work 24 hours a day without rest for many weeks. The border was open day and night. 500 children suffering from oncological diseases came for treatment in Polish hospitals at the invitation of Polish presidential couple. Hundreds of children from orphanages were evacuated from Ukraine. The Happy Kids Foundations organized the arrival of 1,800 children from orphanages and of people with various disabilities from care homes. The greatest problem were caused by the housing, physical and health state, including mental condition of people coming to Poland. It was surprising that the problem of language communication was solved thanks to the Ukrainian students, scholarship holders, and interns who had previously stayed in Poland temporarily. All information needed by refugees was immediately translated into Ukrainian and appeared on the web, in the media, and in the form of advertisements. People hard of hearing were also helped using sign language. Students and academics were invited to the university, and they could get employment for 3 to 6 months. Ukrainian government asked not to give longer employment for these people because Ukrainians want to have these people back to their universities. Human trafficking and drug trafficking was avoided by keeping records of helpers and those who received help. A Polish ombudsman visited the border just to control this situation and to send some recommendation how to control this situation. Shelters were opened for animals with which the refugees traveled and wanted to leave them in Poland. We can see on these pictures this Julia, who got Polish heart. It was the first heart operation and it was transplantation of the heart to Ukrainian very young woman. And you can see twins who are treated in Poland, and their mother decided to stay in Poland forever because of such good medical help which her family got from Polish doctors. But needs are changing, at the moment, migrants need legal advice, for example, on their property left behind in Ukraine, childcare, because parents sometimes are divided. Mother is in Poland, father is in Ukraine. Obtaining long-term health care and rehabilitation in Poland, running a business in Poland and receiving funding for it, and applying for visas by those in transit in other countries. There are Polish language courses for Ukrainians and vocational retraining. Information is provided and diplomas are recognized. The first people who applied for work at job centers in Warsaw were those with higher education. The problem arises of educating children in elementary schools where there are 5, 6 Ukrainian children in a class, and Ukrainian parents want them to be taught in their native language. Now there are 7,000 Ukrainian children in primary schools in Warsaw. There is also a problem with stabilizing the situation of evacuated orphanages and nursing homes. This applies to the finding the permanent accommodation facilities and employing Polish personnel to work with these centers. In Warsaw, the campaign Include Yourself in Life in Poland is being carried out, addressed to women with children. It is about the educational and professional stabilization of migrants who plan to stay in Poland. And the last picture is connected with poets who came to Poland, or they published their poems, their novels in Poland, and they could present their opus, their poems on the radio, on TV, and also there were meetings with these persons. And I'm really, how to say, moved by all these poems, because some of these poems are connected with war events. So I like all of these poets. And it is important to remember that Ukrainian society is really multicultural society. They are not only Ukrainians, they are Russians in Ukraine, they are Poles, they are Hungarians. So this experience of this war is maybe much more difficult because of this differentiation. And maybe at the end, I'd like to show something what is special. There are sweets which are sold in Polish shops just to support and collect a little money to support Ukraine. And also I'd like to say that it was born a small boy some days ago, but he was born, how to say, in a church, in a monastery of Dominicans in Warsaw. And all these monks, all these priests were in love with this Ukrainian boy, and they played with him. And because he was born in Dominican church, his name is Dominic. So it is a quite nice event. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jadwiga. I really explained the sort of scale of the issues with the numbers and refugees in Poland, and I'm sure there'll be some questions later, but we'll go on now to hear from Dr. Jan Serdtse, who has been working in Moldova And Jan is clinical child psychologist and educational psychologist in Israel, and also a researcher at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and working with refugees in Moldova. So Jan, perhaps you could show us your slides.
Thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts here. And I see that people starting to leave, so thank you all that are remaining with us. So I will present briefly my context, that I think it's important why I was interested in this topic. So I originally born and raised until the age of 7 in a small town called Jankoi in the Crimea Peninsula, once USSR, then Ukraine, and today is Russia. Together with my family, we moved to Israel at 91. And for the last 5 years, I am a parent and a professional educational psychologist and clinical child psychologist working in the south part of Israel on the border with Gaza Strip. And when the war has begun, I felt that a lot of my experience of language and cultural experience, and also the context of living and working with communities, educational staff, parents, and children in the context of ongoing traumatic shared reality for the last 20 years in this part of Israel. This reality is very unique, unfortunately, but maybe now luckily for Ukrainian, because we have a lot of experience of how to deal with this ongoing traumatic reality that is also shared traumatic reality due to terror and missile attacks. Because we are, as a community living and working in this environment, we're still awaiting the post stage of PTSD, but we are not lucky yet to having this post stage. So for the first several days of the war in Ukraine, I was recruited by a big group of Israeli Russian-speaking psychologists that opened a hotline for Ukrainian refugees, and we get a lot of phone calls, WhatsApp, Zoom, WeChat, and all these platforms, and we grow for the first week from a small group of 20 Russian-speaking Israeli psychologists to a huge amount of 265 professionals. And this group actually, on today, is still receiving and dealing with these issues as a hotline that is totally volunteer. And at the second week of the war, I was lucky enough to be recruited by an organization that's called Israel, that was deployed to Moldova. And I will show you a short video of the realities that we encountered there. And if the video is not working properly, just tell me and I will try to make it better.
The Ukrainian community is crossing the border. As soon as they cross the border between Ukraine and Moldova, they get on shuttles, and the shuttles just bring them back to here. And when they reach here, it's after many, many hours, sometimes even days, sometimes even needing to sleep in this weather outside on the side of the road.
They call this, it's insane to describe. Like, if you don't live it, it's difficult to understand. But when you spend hours in a border with the snow, and you maybe imagine to be a mother, and you need to think about your kids, and you don't know where you're going. You don't know if a shelter is welcoming you. You don't know if the bus is coming. And you are on an open field full of snow and wind. I leave you the imagination.
The big blue tent, that's a tent that Israel has put up together with a local organization, Keystone Foundation, and we're just really trying to provide a safe, warm space specifically for mothers and babies and children, so they can take a minute to pause, try and get a little bit warm before they kind of gather themselves to continue the journey. Inside the tent, we have a special area dedicated for children, where the volunteers who are trained by Israel are providing kind of psychosocial support, recreational activities, a space for the kids to settle for a minute and the parents to breathe. One kid drew his home, and the road they go escaped to the tent. And like you can see it, the mother is talking about it, but the kid is drawing it. And what are we trying to do is to point out the strong powers of the mothers and to support them, that they did the right thing, they saved their children, now they're in a safe place, and we will do something active to try to go further.
So from this work on the hotline, and also from my work working directly with the children and the refugees in Moldova, and also from workshops and trainings that we provided for the local specialists in Moldova, social workers and psychologists, educational staff, librarians, doctors. So I can say, not from a scientific data collection, but just from the experience, the stories that I heard, I can say that definitely ethical paradoxes and dilemmas of refugees that are most common is that these 5 that I put on the slide, you can see it, and I think that it's in a way resonance, like reminding us themes or topics that are similar to other conflicts or other wars from our past, but some of them are kind of new ones because the context, the reality is a little bit different. And I think that the last one is obvious, that we already forgot the COVID-19 lockdowns, but actually this reality of young mothers spending 24/7 with their children, doing the most important things to save their children, it's also come with a price of being stuck with them. And it's definitely high intensity and raising a lot of challenges in everyday life. And this is important for me to notion it as a last topic, because we definitely can now already think about the price that parents, mothers and fathers are separated from their wives and from their children. And also the children themselves already paying a huge price for this reality. And as a last word, I hope for the Ukraine nation have more luck that we have here in Israel, and see the end of this conflict very, very soon, so they will have the lack of being post-traumatic stage, and will have the support to build their nation again from the point that they are now stated in. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jan. I think that was very a reminder about the children, to see the pictures also of them in the field, and the reality. But as you say, the price they had to pay for being a refugee, and being stuck there with just after COVID again. It's that other, one problem after another. So thank you. I think that's really conveyed some of the issues, and it's wonderful that Israel is providing that support. So we'll go straight on now, and we'll have a discussion after to Jeffrey. So Dr. Jeffrey Demarco, who works along with me as the Associate Director of our Centre for Abuse and Trauma Studies, but is also, in part of his time, is Director of Research for Victim Support in London. And it's in this role that he's had contact with the Ukrainian refugees in the UK. So thank you, Jeffrey.
Thanks, Antonia, and good evening, afternoon, morning. Enter your word of choice for this event. And it's quite a privilege to be here with all of you and to share some of the perspective of what we are seeing on the ground within our organization. What I intend to do quite quickly here is to give you just a lay of the land of who we are as a national organization in supporting all victims and those who have experienced traumatic events across England and Wales, and then get into the specific context of the war in Ukraine. And some really interesting conversations by my fellow speakers today, and I'd really like to touch upon a few of them as I work towards the end and share with you some of the wider unintended impacts and consequences that many people have not necessarily considered. So kind of first and foremost, who are we and what do we do? So Victim Support is one of the largest independent national charities across England and Wales to provide support, all kinds of support, for victims and survivors of crimes and traumatic incidences. And our primary purpose is to provide practical, emotional, and trauma-informed support for them to get through what they've experienced and to ensure that they are able to grow and integrate their own narrative of crime and trauma into their lives. We try and stay away from terminology such as recovery, because one would argue that when experiencing such difficult and traumatic events, one is never going to necessarily recover, but it's about self-growth, and it's about an individual's ability to take that, empower them, and to move on with their lives in a slightly different way. Our advice is free and confidential, and we provide support for anybody, whether or not they report the crime or the experience of victimization to the police. And that's a really important point as I get into talking a bit about our response to Ukrainian arrivals across England and Wales, in that there was a bit of chaos on the ground at the beginning in England and Wales, with no one really necessarily being aware of who was taking leadership in ensuring that things were being done in a safe, inclusive, and holistic way. However, we have a range of practitioners that focus and specialize in a number of victim experiences, so from domestic abuse, sexual violence, hate crime. I know that I have quite a few of my colleagues attending this afternoon, or who were here earlier, that do some really, really good work across the country. And I just want to flag that our support is free and confidential. We are available 24/7, and we have made enormous roots into ensuring our accessibility to arrivals in England and Wales. And I want to just flag the context for all of this from a voluntary and community sector organization, and organizations more widely, that are meant to be supporting people that have experienced crime, trauma, and that there have been two significant events that have allowed us, well, that would hopefully have allowed us to be prepared on the ground to deal with the conflict, or dealing with the arrival of the conflict. On the left-hand side, I have a photograph of arrivals that were associated with the Afghan resettlement project. We look back to approximately 13 months ago, and the fall of Kabul and the entire country of Afghanistan, and an immense influx of individuals coming over for safety and security that was all done quite haphazardly and at the last minute. And I'm sure we all have many opinions of what happened. It's important to reflect that we kind of had a previous experience in dealing with those who had been living through trauma, and that we had an opportunity to learn from perhaps challenges in areas of development. On my right-hand side are some of the trickle effect of those arriving from Ukraine, pardon me, in March 2022. And I say trickle effect, not to be cynical and not to kind of discourage all the good work that's happening across, partner organizations across the country, but also across the world, in that everybody was very quick. And by everybody, I mean governments, I mean third sector organizations, I mean academic institutions. We're very quick to start to host and to have conversations around what we can do and what we should do, but there were delays. There were significant delays, at least from the English and Welsh perspective, from the UK whole perspective, in being able to safely receive individuals and administratively to process what they needed in order to escape the conflict. As a bit of an overview for all of you who aren't aware with our program, we have 3 schemes to receive arrivals and refugees in the country. We have the Ukrainian Family Scheme, which is a scheme that allows those that are individuals or who have families over here to apply for a visa and to seek status over here for protection during the conflict. We have the Ukraine Sponsorship Scheme, which allows for families abroad in Ukraine to be able, who have identified a host or sponsor family, to apply for a visa and to join us. And we have the Ukraine Extension Scheme, which allows for those who had already been in the country prior to the conflict or who may have had their visas expire to apply for an extension and to remain for X amount of time. As of the most current data capture exercise from the government, we've had approximately 213,000 applications across these 3 schemes received. There's been approximately 182,000 visas issued, and we've had approximately 123,000 arrivals across the UK, with an additional 17,000 who have made applications through the extension process. So let's get into actually what we're doing for people. So, I mean, a few of you hopefully will be able to read this, and if there's some grammatical and semantic errors, I must apologize. But again, an organization like our own, who although large, we still work in the third sector, needed to mobilize quite quickly and not wait for government decision-making around what we could and could not do. We are aware there'd be families here. We'd be aware there would be arrivals. We wanted to ensure that people were we were able to at least signpost some kind of support, even if that was an ability to text anonymously with somebody through our live chat function, or to call our services, which again are open 24/7. And I learned very quickly that of all the languages on our national website, we did not have it translated into Ukrainian. So working with an, pardon me?
Why they're not bothering?
What was that? No, just continue, Tony. Is that all right? We discovered very quickly that we had no translations or no material in Ukrainian, so we moved very quickly to translate at the national level, just a little bit of signposting for our support, to make sure that those coming over knew that we were there and that we were signposting this with police across the country, across England, Wales, and with local authorities to ensure that they had translated materials, especially where we knew there were large volumes of arrivals. We weren't expecting the police or the local authority necessarily to absorb everything, but wanted to ensure that they were aware of the resources that we had to offer. So what are the wider impacts? Staying with the theme of trauma, and we've heard a lot about those that are arriving, and again, that is what I want to focus on. But colleagues who I work with that work in operations across the country have also identified the consequences of the conflict across 4 or 3 other groups. So obviously I have the arrivals, the refugees at the very, very big top of this slide. But I also, we are hearing more about kind of violence and hate crime and negative perception of views directed towards all Eastern Europeans, including misidentification of individuals as either being Russian or Ukrainian. So for example, we've been hearing anecdotally about individuals that reside and have settled in the United Kingdom, especially in England and Wales, who may be Moldovan, maybe Polish, maybe Hungarian, and they are being targeted with the assumption that they are either Ukrainian or Russian. We are hearing a lot about hate crimes against Russians living within the country. And we're also hearing anecdotally about the consequences on host families. Consequences of not necessarily being well prepared to deliver trauma-informed support for these families, not having or for the arrivals, of not having the awareness of where to signpost them to for additional help in meeting their mental health needs and the impact of the trauma they may have experienced. And we're also hearing about incidents where there are fraudulent behaviors occurring, which again are then causing harm to all of these groups. My bottom group, The remain is what we are hearing and referring to around individuals that we're supporting here in the country that have family left behind. And there is essentially there's very little to nothing we can do for those that are not in the country, because unless they can contact us through our services, we know they are being left to their own devices. And all we can do is talk emotionally, compassionately, and advocate for those that we have access to on the ground over here to ensure that they are getting directed towards the right avenues to seek further support. So what are we hearing? So, we're all talking about what are the experiences of the arrivals of the refugees? What kind of crime are they affecting? And there were some really interesting points earlier. One in particular made by Ambassador Kantak about victims, right? War crimes. And often there's been this disconnect between philosophy, political sciences, psychology, and criminology on whose academic responsibility it is to explore the consequences of those civilian casualties in particular during a time of war. And utilizing the term victim is so powerful and important because it gives them a name, it gives them a face, and it gives them a collective, cohesive identity. Regardless of what may one think about geopolitics and the political challenges that are occurring with the war in Ukraine, we do know that people are experiencing atrocities, we're hearing about it, and they are fleeing from conditions and experiences that are highly traumatic. Simple things like just the exposure to violence by children and young people and what that may mean to their own normative, formative development. We have heard and have spoken to the media at length through some of our sexual violence contracts and through our independent sexual violence advisors around what we often hear happen during times of war, the weaponization of sexual violence and the use of rape for control, for power and dominance. There have been murmurs of trafficking of families and organized criminality exploiting individuals trying to flee Ukraine to get to the United Kingdom and to other Western allies, which obviously is taking advantage of individuals, victimizing them whilst at their most vulnerable. We're hearing about fraud, a lot of people being defrauded, both arrivals but sponsor families who think they're trying to do the right altruistic thing to get people over, to help people as quickly as they can, and finding out they're sending money to a bogus or a front for individuals that will not necessarily ever arrive here, nor are they Ukrainian, nor are they involved in the conflict in any which way. And I mentioned hate crime and antisocial behavior. Again, some of this will be directed towards non-refugees and non-arrivals, but some of it's also being directed from slightly more extreme and radical groups within the country who are looking at these arrivals as taking away from resources, making them feel unwelcomed, and then subjecting them to their own prejudices, stereotypes, and views. What's really interesting, and touching upon something that Ambassador Abravatova said at the very beginning, is we're all watching this occur live online on a daily basis. And what we fail to include with that concept of this live streaming of a conflict kind of on European soil is the digitization of harm in this as well. It isn't just about that exposure to the violence in person, and it isn't just about perhaps being directly kind of prejudiced and stereotyped or discriminated against because of one's status. It's the use and the harnessing of the power of social media to abuse and to victimize as well, which makes part of the problems very challenging to deal with. So I've touched upon some of the things we're already doing. We have a physical presence where we know large volumes of arrivals are coming with the police and crime commissioners and local authorities. So we're printing out hard copies of pamphlets, of information leaflets, just to make sure people are aware. I've mentioned our interpretation services. We work with an organization called Language Line, who are there to provide us with an interpreter to get onto the phone or for a face-to-face session should that be necessary. We will advocate for these individuals. We will provide them with advice. We will refer to the right services. We appreciate, for example, that sponsor families are not trauma and mental health practitioners, nor should government necessarily have assumed they would have the skills and the expertise to provide that. So what we will do is ensure that we have local connections and national connections to get people the support, advice that they need. We have a voice within what's called the Voluntary and Community Sector Emergencies Partnership. This brings organizations such as the British Red Cross, St. John's Ambulance together. What we've been doing with them and with my role at Victim Support is highlighting the importance of being aware of the signs and symptoms of victimizations against refugees. And lastly, we are there to hold His Majesty's government to account. We will be there to tell the Department for Levelling Up, to tell the Home Office, tell the Ministry of Justice that more investment is needed, more needs to be done, and that due diligence and quality assurance needs to occur to ensure as holistic and appropriate support as possible. So thank you very much for that whistle-stop tour. I know we're going to a period of question and answer right now, but again, thanking you all for listening and appreciating being able to participate in this evening's event.
Thanks, Jeffrey, and thanks for covering situation in the UK and your organisation, and showing some of the pitfalls in terms of trafficking and fraud and other things that might happen alongside helping Ukrainian refugees. Now, I know there's been some questions on chat, but I am very aware of the time, and what I'd like to do is now introduce Professor Ruth Pat-Horenczyk, who is from Israel and is professor at the School of Social Work and Social Welfare at the Hebrew University, who will talk to us about some of the interventions and community resilience that from her own experience and from work in Israel, she can describe for us. And then we'll take questions from the chat line after she's finished. So thank you, Ruth.
Thank you for staying with us. Certainly show resilience. It's time to move to clinical implications and to discuss what we learned from the theory and research and the community work and how we can translate it into interventions. What are the lessons learned? So, we heard a lot about intergenerational transmission of trauma and about trauma and PTSD, but what are the messages for effective interventions and building community resilience, as well as clinical efforts to try to mitigate the intergenerational transmission of trauma? So based on our extensive experience with trauma victims and building resilience across the globe, I can summarize very briefly several lessons learned. The first one is the need to plan and create continuity of services. Larysa mentioned preparedness. This is absolutely necessary to start and prepare intervention before disaster happened, during the trauma, and in the aftermath of trauma. Unfortunately, we see that many people care after something traumatic happened and people are willing to come and help for immediate interventions. But what happened after 3 months? What happened after 6 months? Are there still services there? And the needs may change or are changing. We also learned that effective interventions should address individual, family, community, and cultural level, as pointed out before. But it also should be planned to adapt to young children, to adolescents, to parents, and to elderly, to take the developmental approach as part of the intervention. We also learned that there is a need to combine both community intervention to build resilience and to sustain the resilience of the community, but also clinical intervention for those who are mostly affected and need treatment. And not to forget the helpers, both professionals and volunteers. We need to help the helpers and to care for the caregivers and provide support for the helper through. As we saw in Jan's short clip, they are exposed to severe trauma and they need a professional support as well. So the real preparedness starts with the pre-event, during the event, the immediate care, taking into account the community and individual needs, and planning for long-term. I just want to focus on 3 major issues, just to raise them for the discussion. What about the young children that Jan mentioned? How can we talk with young children about what happened? How can we mediate it? How do we build community resilience? And how do we try to help the helpers? So just a brief discussion of how can we talk with young children refer to this very difficult topic of loss and grief, trauma and violence, and yet we need to provide them also with meaning and hope. There is a need to create for any age group a narrative of the event which reflects the reality and yet is adjusted for their age. We are the adults are responsible to monitor their exposure to media coverage and photos, and not to avoid it, but to mediate the news with the support and providing meaning and hope. We don't lie to children and we don't keep secret. We try to communicate it in the way that it tells the story age appropriately and in line with the child's ability to comprehend his interest and pace. There are lots of practical guidelines. I just brought an example. You can find it in many online websites, but all in general, it's important to be there, emotionally available for the child, to listen with no judgment and not to avoid the topic, and yet to stay in their own pace, to answer the questions, not to push it too forward, answer the question and move according to the child pace. Stay calm and identify and be sensitive about your own responses. We are the adult or the parents can help the children to relax and to feel safe, even under threat. And we need to provide them with predictable routine that protect them, to set boundaries, not to lose boundaries, to let them feel that we are still in control in our life and not rushing with changes of daily routine. We can suggest them to write about it or to show it, to express their emotion in different art. We can try to see how they can help others, because this is the best resource to help others. And if needed, there is a possibility to get external help. Just a slide about building community resilience. There was a consensus paper that most trauma and resilience experts participate in writing it, and they try to identify the core principles for building resilience intervention post-disasters, regardless of the type of the disaster. And they identify 5 major principles. That post-disaster, what is very important to do is first to create a sense of safety, to take care of this basic need. First, safety and calming. And then to try to activate sense of efficacy in the individual and the community, give them active role, try to do something, give the feeling that the community is coping. From my own experience, I remember I was in Haiti post the earthquake. The day after, we opened a big tent and asked for the teachers in the tent city to come and started a school, to start a daily routine, and the community is able to continue and to provide a safety and daily routine to the community. And Connectedness. There is no more important principle than social support and connect people around shared meaning and shared hope. Another example that I just briefly want to mention is the psychological first aid. Here I refer to immediate intervention, and there is evidence-based module of how to intervene post-disaster. And that acknowledges the fact that survivors and witnesses and responders are affected by such mass trauma. And the psychological first aid is designed to reduce initial stress, and it can be implemented in the early days after the disaster. And that includes 8 principles. First, the contact and engagement. We need to contact the survivors and give them this safety and initial engagement of a compassionate helper. We need to stabilize them. The first need is to provide them with food and shelter and safety. Need to provide them with reliable information and to gather their specific need and concerns. The practical assistance comes first, not psychology first, but practical assistance first, and connection with their social supporter, with their meaningful people. And then come the psychology, information about coping. How can they cope better with this situation? What can be helpful to reduce stress and anxiety? And we are responsible to link them with the relevant collaboration of services. One comment on continuous traumatic stress that was mentioned before. What happened if the threat is not over, as Jan wished for Ukraine? If it's still going, the fear is still there. How can you create, maintain services and continuity of services under continuous traumatic stress? And here, the importance of psychoeducation and reliable information cannot be more central. Active and flexible coping and designing of role. We need to be flexible with the roles and encourage volunteering and helping others. We need to emphasize the regulation on both the physical level and affect. The solidarity and social support is our main resource. This is the main resource for resilience. And meaning making is a process. It's an ongoing process. Just one comment on helping the helpers. We shouldn't forget them. As people mentioned before, they live in shared traumatic reality, and the effect on the helpers need to be acknowledged. It can be secondary traumatization. It can include compassion fatigue, which kind of a new term that the helpers also are affected and maybe burnout. And there is a need to set limit and to take care of these helpers, to provide them with reflective space for processing, to look for their resources and to validate their pain and their strengths and provide them with social support. The expectation that those who are immersed in suffering and loss on daily basis will not be deeply touched is not realistic, and it's our responsibility to support the supporters. Thank you, and we are really interested to hear your comments, questions to all presenters and ideas. Thank you for staying with us.
Thank you, Ruthie. That was really illuminating and maybe gave some answers to various questions that have arisen about what can we do, and the whole thing of the first aid analogy helping helpers because of compassion fatigue. As this goes on further and further, people just kind of can run out of steam, so they need help too. And the thing of continuous stress. How do you help people when they aren't in a safe situation, as would be desirable for most of these therapies? So I think we've not got many minutes for our discussion, and you know, we'll have to do something more in the future. But just a couple of things that were on the chat, and unless there's anything, let me just see, there's one on the chat that might be.
Yeah, so I'll help you, Antonia, because I gathered the 2 or 3 questions.
Okay, good, very good.
And just to say, we fully understand those that need to go. Thank you so much for staying with us until now. It was absolutely riveting, and we will only take a few minutes. If you can still stay for a few minutes to hear some of the reflections of our panelists, that will be great. And maybe I will start with a question which is really interesting about from Jadwiga. What is the effect of the international solidarity on the reduction of the war trauma? And maybe because of this live intervention, which is, as a genocide scholar, I can tell you, is absolutely, it was never done. That as the war is happening, war crimes investigations and testimonies are being collected, and so much more is being collected. So maybe, Danny, if you can bring all our panelists to be spotted, and I will gather a few questions and then just choose which one you would like to speak about. So the first was about the reduction of war trauma because of this involvement of the war. And then a question about the 3, can you please expand on your comment that community identity is built around a common trauma, and that is from Stefan. So that question, if we can answer that. Thank you to Irina, who shared her family very tragic history and how the trauma is living intergenerationally, and how in another comment that brings to empathy with what is happening to Ukraine. So maybe something about that. I mean, cross from one trauma to empathizing with another trauma unfolding. And then maybe the last one, or we'll do maybe another round. Let's take those 3, and then we'll do one quick other round.
I'll kick off if nobody else has got something immediately ready. I think it was the thing I mentioned about event centrality that came out in one of the papers I was reading about Intergenerational, and that is that a later generation has a theme within their family about the particular trauma, whether it's Holocaust, whether it was the Siberian deportations, etc. And you know, that drives a lot of their behavior of finding out more about the stories, of wanting to understand how the political thing affected their family relationships, etc. And it seems to me that could be for better or worse. I think, and thank you, Stefan, for the question. On the positive side, I think it gives people a sense of communality. They help each other on Facebook and other sites like the Cressy family, like the Serdtse in South Africa, to find out more information about their family when they don't know what's happened or where people went, etc. So it gives them you know, a meaning, I would say. On the negative side, I've come across stories where the 2nd or 3rd generation didn't know what happened, and they found out and were absolutely shocked. And say grandparents who died, and they never asked them about it because they never heard. It was only subsequently they found out, and they described that as a main trauma themselves. And it somehow didn't get resolved because people concerned were gone and they couldn't ask. So I think it can have a negative effect, but what I've seen of communities who come together around these topics, it can also be very supportive. What were the other topics?
So about the West response about reduction of trauma, if anyone has a comment about that.
I'll comment on that slightly, Tali, if that's all right. I mean, again, a lot of our work was qualitative insight and anecdotal. So I would, on the one hand, you know, with the researcher and academic hat on, I don't want to utilize the data to suggest and generalize, but it's important to recognize that a lot of kind of countries and nations and organizations saying they're going to help, but getting in the way can obviously let people down. And we saw a little bit of that with the Afghan resettlement program, where you had kind of large multinational organizations and governments kind of claiming live about how important it was that people did, that what the Taliban at the time were doing was wrong, but they weren't then doing anything necessarily to actually quickly and helpfully assist. And at the beginning of the Ukrainian arrival process, there was kind of memories of some of that and dilution of access to care. And I think that worries me to an extent. And so, although I think it's important to demonstrate kind of international community coherence and, you know, allow for integration and show that we have support and that we're there, we also need to back that with actual tangible outcomes and actions. Otherwise, you know, Ukrainians that are still suffering are going to be like, well, what are you doing that's tangible? And it's not going to motivate people to actually feel like this is going to come to an end.
I think on the other side of the coin, what I showed is how some events in the past were nullified. It was denied that they happened. And if they didn't happen, how could you talk about it? It couldn't be researched. If you know, like in Poland or Russia, they said something didn't happen, how could anybody research it? So it was kind of a null topic. Now we have something completely different, where at least in the West, I mean, it'd be interesting to know later what happens in Russia. I can't remember who it was who said, you know, what about Russians who perhaps don't know what's going on and will then find out later. Presumably. But I think the fact that people are collecting evidence of criminal or war crime behavior, the fact that we can see what's happening, there's been, I think, some very good reporting over here from people, reporters who've gone over to Ukraine and are there observing. It makes it very realistic. So I would have thought that it would make the Ukrainians feel validated in what they're experiencing, and that the rest of the world, or much of the world, is with them. So I don't know if it will help with an individual trauma response, but I think that idea of people supporting them is perhaps important. Larysa, I don't know if you have.
Yeah, I'd like to add something as Ukrainian, not like a scholar, but like as Ukrainian who experiencing this trauma. And I'd like to say that this social support and solidarity, it was very important for us, especially at the initial stages of the war when we were very shocked, yes. And it's certainly contributed to our resilience, because it was very important that all world supported us. It's like a very, very great resource, personal resource, community resource. So it's very important, and thank you for it. And as for previous trauma, yeah, there is research and a lot of data that some previous traumas form or develop some predisposition for PTSD when there is the next traumatic event. So that's why these traumas, family traumas or genocide traumas in Ukrainian families, Ukrainian communities, of course, they develop some predisposition for PTSD during this war atrocity.
Maybe just, sorry, if you can just add about the empathy between, you know, a survivor or intergenerational survival of war trauma to what is happening to Ukraine, which is a few people commented on.
Right, but empathy, we have contradictory as well data for empathy, because on one side it's okay, it's good, but another we have this compassion fatigue, which is also could be associated with extra empathy. So probably Ruth could talk about it at more deeper level. Ruth, could you please comment it, because I know that you are involved in this.
Yeah, my empathy now goes to the participant here that went through exposure to so many important, really, and moving and emotional materials. That's a really interesting topic that I look forward maybe to continue in another group discussion.
Perfect, absolutely perfect. And what I
Yeah.
suggest I'll do, many people gave their email and did some comments and wonderful reflections. I'm saving the chat. It will be available also for other participants that joined us today. But Antonia, maybe let's close with your final reflection before I thank everyone.
We'll take care of the participants.
Exactly, exactly.
Well, just thank you for everybody who participated. It's such an important topic. We've really just touched the surface. More discussion will be needed. But I think, personally, I think the fact that the West and so much of the world has supported Ukraine must be a very positive thing for Ukrainian families who are going through such hell at the moment. And now we know there's been some sort of military victory. Let's hope that things move to a positive conclusion before too long. And thank you, everybody, for listening to us today.
So it's my absolute honor and pleasure to bring to a close this absolutely fascinating conference with great thanks to all the presenters today and to all the ambassadors for their very thoughtful addresses in the start of the conference. And of course, to you, Antonia, for helping us to put this all together, and to the team at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centre for organizing it all. Thank you to all for staying with us for so long. Thank you, good night, and please do continue to join these very important discussions as we take them forward. Good night and all the very best.
Thank you, Tali. Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.